This happened to me when I was in high school. I was at my friend's house at the time, who lived in an apartment building. She had a neighbor who lived upstairs and was a few years younger than us, who we hung out with when I visited my friend's apartment. On this specific day, my friend's neighbor mentioned that she had an Ouija board and asked if we wanted to use it with her. We both agreed, as I personally didn't think Ouija boards were actually paranormal and thought it was a myth. We went into a garage area of the apartment building and put our fingers on the planchette. For the first few hours, nothing really eventful happened. Eventually, we had movement on the planchette and started asking questions to this spirit who would answer us. I forgot who, but someone asked if the spirit was trying to communicate with any of us. Interestingly enough, it spelled out my name. I was skeptical and thought it was one of my friends messing with me, so I asked what its name was. It then spelled out my grandmother's name, who died 6 months before this Ouija board encounter. I started getting a little uncomfortable, as my grandmother's name is in another language, and my friends did not know this language, nor have I ever told them what her name was. They wouldn't even know how to spell it either. Weirded out, I asked what my grandmother wanted. She started spelling out URGR, and then the planchette started going in weird circles and even going off of the board, and was not spelling out anything that made sense. So I asked for further clarification, and then just said, "You are great. This will be important later, so keep this in mind." Anyway, I just thought it was just us moving it weirdly, and then said goodbye. A few days later, my grandmother's husband, my grandfather, suddenly passed away. It was unexpected, as he was in great health and was right before Christmas, and was so excited for Christmas. As I was at his funeral, I remembered sitting there and thinking about the Ouija board, and that's when it hit me. When the Ouija board, or my grandmother, initially tried to spell out something that started with GR, I realized that grandfather starts with GR. But then the planchette moved around weirdly when my grandmother couldn't spell out the rest of the word, as if something was stopping my grandmother from completing the word and warning me. The next few months was hell, as I started blaming myself and was convinced that I somehow contributed to my grandfather's death by using this board. It got to the point that I became suicidal, and the scary part is, my thoughts felt as if it wasn't me. It felt as if something was trying to lead me to taking my life, as they were very dark. I can't explain it, as it might have been guilt, but I felt like something was watching me all the time, and I felt a strange presence in the next few months after using the board. There is also the fact that the night of when I used the Ouija board, I was in the bathroom, and I was underneath some lights. I had a strange feeling and felt that I needed to walk away. Right when I did, the light shattered and would have injured me if I was standing underneath. I eventually confessed to my mother about the Ouija board experience, and right when I did, I felt a giant weight off of my shoulders. The negative and dark thoughts were slowly disappearing, and I started to not feel the dark presence anymore when I overcame these thoughts. However, I was still wondering if the spirit I contacted to was even my grandmother. I also wondered if I was imagining this dark presence and the dark thoughts I had. Fast forward, I was at an overnight event at my school, and another friend brought a Ouija board. I decided to use it one more time with this friend and find some answers. At one point, The Ouija board said it was trying to contact me specifically. When we asked who it was, it then started spelling out Dev. We started panicking, but then it spelled out to a word that I forgot. I dismissed it and thought it was nothing, but my friend decided to look up the word. A few weeks later, she told me that the word meant devil in another language. It was then it was confirmed to me that it might not have been my grandmother who was contacting me the first time. There is also the fact that there may have been something that was trying to get to me, and it did not have good intentions. To this day, I am convinced that this spirit only tried to warn me about my grandfather, so that when he passed, I would have felt guilty. By feeling guilty, I was more vulnerable to this spirit's influences, to the point that I would almost take my life. I do not know if this actually happened, but it's the only logical explanation I have. I was taught ghosts weren't real. My mother and father laughed off any mention of the paranormal and called people who believed crazy. I was proud to be the kid in my friend group who wasn't afraid of ghosts or spooky stories. It never crossed my mind that they could be true because everything had an explanation. We moved into an old Victorian house in the PNW in the early 2000s. The house had been built over 100 years ago in a small lumber town. It was beautiful and a fixer-upper. It had a real crystal chandelier, stained glass windows, a dilapidated claw foot tub in the basement, and was falling apart in places. My parents were determined to patch it up over time. One place they never got around to was the basement. Being down there gave you the feeling it hadn't changed much since the house was first built a century ago. Welcoming is not a word I would use to describe it. There was always a sense of being watched. It was dark and dingy. The only light was a single, bare bulb in the support beams. Not even the adults could stand being down there for long. I caught my mom running up the basement stairs a few times and quickly shutting the door behind her like something scared her. When I asked what was wrong, she would pretend she was fine. I would learn years later that both of my parents were terrified of the basement without being able to pinpoint why. It became a storage space. Odd things happened in the house that I made up reasons for. My little brother and I's doors faced each other on the second floor. One night, we both heard a shrieking sound outside our doors, like a woman was being killed in the hallway. We opened our doors at the same time and confirmed we both heard it. I told him it was probably just cats fighting outside. I went back to bed, where I tried to convince myself it was just cats. Except, why would the sounds come from the hall and not from outside our windows? We didn't have pets either. Another night, I was staying up past my bedtime to read under the covers with a flashlight. My bed began to shake violently. I thought it was an earthquake. I had already been through one that was a 6.8 magnitude, so I held on and waited it out. When it subsided, I ran to the living room where my father was. I asked if he felt the earthquake. He hadn't felt a thing. That was concerning, so I pressed him. He told me it must have been a large truck passing by. So I returned to my room and tried to convince myself that's all it was. The incident that I could not explain happened shortly before we moved out. I was asked to retrieve something from the basement for my mother. I begrudgingly obliged. It still gave me the creeps. So I went down, pretending to not feel the oppressive energy that hung over the room. As I was searching through a box, I felt an overwhelming sensation that something was telling me to look up. It felt important, so I did. My eyes went up to a shelf across the room. There was a row of large spools of ribbon my mother used for presents. They had sturdy, circular bases around 4 inches in diameter, if I had to estimate. It would take something more than wind or shaking from a large vehicle to do what I saw next. I will never forget this moment because it made me question my perception reality for the first time in my life. It was dead quiet as I watched one of the spools slowly tip over onto its side and roll off the shelf. I could barely comprehend what I had just seen, and I wasn't going to find out if ghosts were real by sticking around. I flew up the stairs and took a walk to my friend's house. I told no one about it until I was in my 20s. I didn't think anyone would take me seriously. Surprisingly, all these years later, my parents believed me. This happened in, I believe, July or August of 2017. My husband, our 3 daughters, and I were at the beach having a get-together with some of my extended family who lived in the area. It was a really nice time and good to connect with everyone. But after a couple hours, my second oldest, age 13 at the time, came up to me and asked if I could take her home. I could tell by her expression and tone that she was pretty tired. She and I are both introverts, and I'm sure she was less than thrilled to be spending a nice summer night with her cousins that are all a good deal older than her. I wasn't feeling too great myself, so I found my husband and let him know that I was going to take her home and to let our other girls know. She and I got in the car. We had brought 2 since my husband came to the beach on his own after golfing and made the short 5-minute drive back to our house. It was only once we'd parked, gotten up onto the porch, and jiggled the door handle when we realized it was locked and we didn't have a key. My husband had the main one, and the absence of our fake rock in the garden told me that my eldest daughter had once again used the spare to get inside and had left it in the house. This was all very inconvenient, but nothing that hadn't happened before. So I told my daughter to go around back and try to climb in through the huge window above the kitchen sink. While she was making her way around the house, I tried calling my husband just in case she couldn't get in, but he didn't pick up the phone. Once again, not too out of the ordinary. The reception at the beach is terrible, and he was probably busy anyway. I was in the middle of trying to call my oldest daughter when I looked through the window next to the front door, which allows you to see through to the kitchen in the back, and saw my daughter standing in the kitchen doorway. It was dark thanks to the screen, so I could only make out her silhouette, but it was definitely her. I know my daughter. She's quite short like me and has a very petite figure like my mom. I could recognize her from miles off. "Great job," I remember calling out. "Come unlock the door now." She didn't move. By the way she was standing, I could tell that she was staring right at me, but she didn't move a muscle. At first I thought maybe she was on her phone or something, but I could clearly see her arms on either side of her. She was standing in quite an odd position as well. Her feet were a good distance apart, and her arms were slightly raised from her sides. I didn't feel uneasy yet, but I was very confused as her, and I continued to stare at one another for several more seconds. "Lily?" I remember saying again. No more than 5 seconds after her name left my mouth, my daughter came jogging out from the side of the house and up the steps, telling me she couldn't get inside because there was a screen on the kitchen window and she couldn't pry it off. I stared at my daughter, my real daughter, for multiple seconds with what must have been a very terrified expression because her face instantly fell and she asked me if everything was okay. I couldn't answer, and I remember feeling my whole body start to shake as I slowly looked back at the window and into the house. Maybe I had imagined it. No. This thing in my house was now in the living room, still standing in that weird position and staring right at me, but now at least 10 feet closer. Fear and adrenaline shot through my veins in a way only a mother can know, and I practically yanked my daughter from those steps as we ran to the neighbor's house to get a spare key. Whatever was in my house was gone by the time we returned, or at least out of eyesight from the window. But I did not let my daughter leave the neighbor's house until I had inspected every inch to make sure there was no intruder. When I had more or less calmed down and was positive no one was inside, the whole thing started to seem more and more ridiculous as it played out in my head. The human brain automatically tries to give everything a logical explanation, so the more I thought about it, the more I was feeling like it had been imagined. I barely even considered calling the police. What would I say to them? "Hello, officers. I saw something in my house that looked exactly like my daughter, but I don't know what it was because she was standing right next to me when it happened." Absolutely not. I eventually chalked it up to me being exhausted or whatever, because honestly, what else could it have been? The last thing I wanted to worry about was some random thing in my house acting like the girl from The Ring. I didn't tell my daughter about my experience. I just apologized for losing it a bit and told her I thought I saw a wasp's nest. A terrible lie truly, but she was either too tired or didn't care enough to question it, and her and I went straight to the TV room to watch her favorite show, Criminal Minds. This was not exactly my first choice of programs after whatever had just happened, but if it meant getting to keep an eye on my daughter for the night, I was more than happy to oblige. I know I said I chalked it up to imagination, but I still couldn't shake that feeling that my girl was in danger. It tormented me for the rest of the night, and I must have checked on her at least 5 times while she was sleeping. Over 3 years later, I still think about it frequently, and it seems less and less like a terrifying daydream. I am almost positive that there was something in my house that night